overall philanthropy in the U.S. just a little under $500 billion, and that is inflation adjusted. It's actually a slight decrease, and so that's, especially in the 2022 year, I'm sure that will also be a decrease. A lot of folks are going to need to figure out how to battle inflation with more donor dollars. You can see the mix, though, from this Giving USA report. The predominant amount of giving has always been individuals, although foundations have steadily been increasing as a percentage of overall giving for the last, I believe, 11 years. And so that includes community foundations and donor advised funds. So that trend has continued for quite a while. Bequests and planned gifts are also a percentage, and then corporations make up the final bit. We can see a little bit of a breakdown by sector here, and this is sort of, the trends are fairly consistent, except for 2021, the arts and culture grants and health have seen a bit of a rebound. So arts and culture got some pickup in donations after the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic. What I'd like to cover the next few slides is a quick matrix of some of the different vehicles that we're going to be discussing. We won't go into all of these in great detail, so this summary slide is helpful, and there's a couple more that cover some more different vehicles. But we're going to be talking about donor advised funds, traditional, unconditional gifts, conditional gifts. Briefly, we're going to touch on crowdfunding, fiscal sponsorship, and a few other things. So basically just a high level summary for you of where these types of gifts may be utilized and when they might be beneficial for certain circumstances. We get into things like appreciated property and securities. We'll touch very briefly on crypto, this concept of recoverable grants, some planned giving items, cause marketing is another type. And then we get into the investments, which are things like forgivable loans or loan guarantees. There's mission-related investments and program-related investments. And then we wrap up with things like pay for success. Those are the initial versions were things like social impact bonds. And then nowadays there's a newer type of item called an impact security that I'll walk through in some detail. The advantages here, it's a kind of a quick startup approach to getting philanthropy out, getting your philanthropy done. It can often be done in conjunction with setting up a separate private foundation, which allows a donor more control than a donor advised fund. But generally, donor advised funds are a little bit less hassle. They come with philanthropic advisors that work for the community foundation. And if you are looking to do something pretty quickly, that's often an easy approach. Some funders, including those with private foundations, like to do what's called flexible grant making. So they might have their philanthropy through their own personal contributions. They might have it through a donor advised fund, and they might have a private foundation. So I have seen some funders write grants and contributions in a way that is really, at the end of the day, more of an intention to give, because they basically said, we intend to give you money, but we don't know what pocket it's going to come out of yet. So it could come out of me personally, it could come out of my foundation, it could come out of a donor advised fund. So this is really not an enforceable pledge per se, it's more of an intention. And so that's a strategy some funders will utilize. And then there's a bit about some proposed legislation that Tami will get into on the coming slides. We do have separate training materials on DAFs versus private foundations that we can provide you if you reach out after the event. All yours, Tami.
All right. So so as Daniel said, I'd say these are the most commonly ways that we're seeing our clients fund charitable gifts currently. And so they're the most popular tool. And certainly kind of post 2020, people are looking for simplicity. And so donor advised funds are the most popular way that we see in our private client group for people to fund charitable gifts. They're very simple, very easy to set up, and a great popular tool. And from the charity side, this is what we consider good public support, because a donor advised fund is a public charity. And so when you're doing your public support test under the current law, it is generally counted as public support, not limited to a particular funder. That could change. So, but under the current law, they're still considered good public supports. And that's because the donors have advisory privileges, but they're not ultimately the ones that are making the decision to grant. It's the donor advised fund that's actually making the grant. And so that discretion is still at the donor advised fund level. And so a private foundation can currently grant to a donor advised fund as well, and that can count as a qualifying distribution. But you have to do additional disclosure on the private foundation return, and there are some proposed changes to these laws.
A type of instrument that's been created recently is an impact security. An organization called NPX is the one that's coined this term. And it's modeled off of kind of the social impact bonds that were all the rage in the early 2012, 2013, and still continue to this day. But essentially, you're getting groups of people together. On one side, you have investors that provide the upfront capital. Sounds a lot like a recoverable grant. And on the other side, you have donors that will pay money later only once they see outcomes achieved. So the donors on that side get the satisfaction of not giving up their money until outcome has been achieved, versus the investors get a potential return on their investment as their side of the equation. So there's some terminology here as to who are the parties and all that, but essentially it's a legal debt instrument that's created. And so in this case, an impact security would look something like this. So let's say you get a $1 million impact security for College for Kids. It is the impact metric that everyone agreed to is the number of gainfully employed college graduates that come out of their programs. And they're willing to pay $1,000 per unit of impact, so per college graduate. So total potential impact payments, including the return on the investment, is $1.1 million. So if all this is successful, the investor will get $100,000 return on their investment. The way that the money is raised from the donors is through a collective effort of finding those donors, and a DIF, or donor impact fund, is oftentimes created to find those community foundations, private foundations, high net worth donors that want to make a donation but don't want to give up money until they see impact. If impact is not achieved at the full amount, then any of the amount that's not achieved will be forgiven at the end. So here's the first scenario where you have all of the impact achieved. And so you get the $1 million up front, you record debt for $1 million. Associated with this arrangement is a commitment from the donor impact fund for the $1.1 million, but you do not record that because it is a conditional gift. Again, only due based on impact. So those donors are protected. If there is no impact, they don't have to give up the money that they committed as a donation. In this case, they got 1,100 units of impact achieved, so they record the $1.1 million of cash from the donor fund and record that $1.1 million contribution at that later time. The $1.1 million does get used simultaneously to repay the investors. So the $1 million of debt goes away, you record $100,000 of interest at that time, and then you release the restrictions. In a different scenario, if you've got only 800 units of impact, you still get the $1 million up front to do what you need as a nonprofit, don't record the conditional gift, and you only end up with $800,000 from the donor pool of money. So you repay the investors $800,000. The investors end up forgiving the $200,000 that's left, and you will take that in as a gain on forgiveness at that time at the end. So the nonprofit doesn't end up owing anything. They still got the money to work on their program and their impact. It's just structured in a way that either the investor ends up without all their investment back, or the donors end up giving all the money, which they would have given anyways. It's an interesting scenario. It's not too different than a social impact bond, which is basically the government is the one that's paying for the outcomes and impact, as opposed to a private pool of donors. But it's a similar type of relationship where you've got somebody paying for outcomes, a separate group of investors giving the upfront capital. So these are just some statistics on the state of social impact bonds currently.